Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, I will introduce this debate, and I will do it in French because it's also the language of the Royal Academy of Belgium, and it will be less work for our translator. Donc je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ce soir dans le cadre de ces rencontres internationales de l'Académie royale de Belgique. Nous avons souhaité à l'Académie royale apporter un éclairage sur la manière dont un certain nombre de personnalités académiques, acteurs, témoins de la vie internationale voyaient les relations internationales, aussi pour satisfaire à l'une de nos missions, qui est de réconcilier le local et le global, et d'expliquer aussi à une majorité de nos concitoyens l'évolution de ce monde de plus en plus global. Et dans les thématiques actuellement d'actualité, il y a bien évidemment la question du Brexit. Et tout le monde en parle, mais il se fait qu'à Bruxelles, probablement en raison de notre position au cœur de l'Europe, ce débat est systématiquement présenté dans une forme d'opposition, ou en tout cas de confrontation, entre la Grande-Bretagne et l'Europe. La Grande-Bretagne, les îles britanniques et le continent. Or, le Brexit est aussi une matière interne, profondément interne à la politique de la Grande-Bretagne. Elle pose des questions sur le développement et sur le positionnement de la Grande-Bretagne par rapport aux autres pays et donc par rapport au contexte international. Et c'est cet angle-là que nous avons voulu, à l'Académie aujourd'hui, aborder. Non pas cette confrontation entre l'Europe et la Grande-Bretagne, mais aussi essayer de mieux comprendre le débat interne à la Grande-Bretagne qui se pose à travers le Brexit. Et je voudrais donc remercier très chaleureusement nos deux conférenciers d'aujourd'hui, professeur Gamble et professeur Thoms, qui seront présentés dans un instant par le professeur Telò. Je remercie également Mario Telò pour sa participation active comme membre de notre académie, bien évidemment, à l'organisation de ce cycle de rencontres internationales. Je voudrais aussi remercier deux partenaires extrêmement importants, la Fondation Wiener Hansbach et notamment son administratrice Christine Barty, qui nous fait le plaisir d'être là aujourd'hui, et puis l'Institut d'études européennes de l'Université libre de Bruxelles et sa directrice ou présidente, je ne sais jamais, je pense que c'est présidente, et pour le coup ça sera autre chose, mais le professeur Anne Weyenberg, également membre de notre académie et de la classe des lettres et des sciences morales et politiques. Voilà, je n'en dis pas plus parce que l'essentiel sera évidemment dit par les conférenciers et puis aussi par vous, puisque à l'issue de ce débat, il y aura une proposition de prise de parole par vous-même à propos de ce sujet extrêmement important. Je vous remercie pour votre présence et je cède immédiatement la parole au professeur Telò.
Oui, merci beaucoup, secrétaire perpétuel. Je vais présenter les orateurs et poser quelques questions qui nous sont à cœur. Mais d'abord, je voudrais, comme l'a fait le secrétaire perpétuel, saluer la présence ici de son éminence, le British Ambassador of Brussels, Alison Rose, et notre public tant les fidèles qui sont venus déjà aux autres séances de rencontres internationales, que les nouveaux, aussi facilités par la traduction simultanée. Je voudrais d'abord remercier Madame Bartik pour avoir contribué par la Fondation Wiener Hansbach et son staff à notre initiative, et l'Institut d'études européennes, la présidente Anne Weyenberg, et tout le staff de l'Institut qui a contribué à l'organisation et à la promotion de cette initiative. Didier Viviers, le secrétaire perpétuel, avec ses collaboratrices, ses collaborateurs, nous ont beaucoup aidés. Et je voudrais aussi remercier Madame Mogherini, qui a voulu offrir son haut patronage à la série des rencontres internationales de notre académie. Merci beaucoup, et je devrais saluer aussi les ambassadeurs, les professeurs, les collègues, les étudiants présents, mais je n'ai pas le temps. Donc, I'm shifting to English. We started this cycle of rencontres internationales in June, last June, and many of you were in this room, by two enlightening lectures, respectively illustrating by critical approaches the United States and the China vision of the current uncertain world. The common question was how fragile, how fragmented, and how resilient is the current multilateral global governance, the multilateral framework of governance. The president of the China Foreign Affairs University, Professor Qin Yaqin, focused on the challenge of what he defined in an original way, the populist nationalist realism, and pleaded in favor of a multilateral new post-hegemonic cooperation based on what he called the 3 Ps: participation, pluralism, and partnership. John Eikenberry, on his side, Princeton University, underlined how, in spite of internal and external challenges, including the Brexit, not only the multilateral institutional framework issued of the World War II, but also European institutionalized cooperation reveals as very relevant and resilient, and can adjust maybe to the current great transformation in a flexible way. This is a relevant bridge with the today debate. We have proposed to the two outstanding Cambridge professors, Professor Thoms and Professor Gamble, to focus on Brexit, in particular to its international, not domestic, but international implications. An event which has been several times mentioned by the previous speakers, not only because it is at the center of the European agenda, but because it is, whatever our appreciation, extremely rich in political, economic, international, domestic, and even theoretical implications, deserving a careful and multidisciplinary attention by our academy and our qualified public of Brussels. Whatever the outcome of the present, even of the today, if I may say, domestic politics controversies, it is highly realistic that the exit of the United Kingdom out of the European Union will happen after 40 years of sometimes turbulent, sometimes stimulating membership. So we are in face of an historical event for both the European Union and for the United Kingdom. Before giving the floor to our outstanding guests, I think it may be worth shortly remembering the basic facts and addressing two main questions. The referendum of 23rd June 2016 gave a short majority to Brexit, contrary to the recommendation of the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. The next government, led by Theresa May, began a negotiating period on 29th March 2017, when the United Kingdom served the withdrawal notice under Article 50 of the Treaty of European Union, and the negotiation started, led on the UK side by Brexit Secretary David Davis, who resigned and was replaced by Dominic Raab in July 2018. And for the European Union by Michel Barnier. Well, Michel Barnier, precisely in this room, in last June, presented his realist vision of the alternative scenarios of the future relation between European Union and UK, precisely in this academy. The Norwegian scenario, the Turkish scenario, the Canadian scenario, or something as an unprecedented status. Actually, this uncertainty did not disappear at all during the summer. The negotiation revealed the huge difficulties by disentangling a country from the EU after decades of European economic and legal integration. The legal status of both the European Union citizens in the UK and the UK citizens in the EU, the controversy about the Irish border, and the next relationship between the European Union and the UK are some of the main issues still at stake. This divorce looks to many observers of both sides as the opposite of a win-win game, unfortunately, while other comments look at the Brexit as an opportunity. An opportunity for the European Union, for integrating deeper and faster in crucial policy areas, a Eurozone, the defense by the new PESCO, the fight against criminality, yesterday we discussed about it with Anne Weinberg here present, towards a more political union, not a superstate, including security, sovereignty, and on the other hand, the opportunity, as an opportunity also for the UK, the opportunity for the UK, according to some, for a new role as a national power in international relations. This will be one of the most relevant topics of today. How will internationally evolve the post-Brexit UK, suppose that the Brexit will actually somehow be implemented, either by a withdrawal agreement before next March 2019, followed by a temporary transitional period agreement until December 2020, already negotiated, or worst case scenario, by a new no deal, no agreement. In any case, the decision of the UK to go alone, to revive the myth of global Britain, deserves international attention because it is addressing extremely relevant questions for our future and for the research community. I would like to address two of them, confident that the two presentations by the Cambridge professors will help us to further deepen our reflection. First, we are conscious of the weakness of the Remain campaign in 2016, mainly stressing poor utilitarian arguments, whereas the Brexiters' rhetorics emphasized great ideas: global Britain, democracy, citizenship, national sovereignty. But the question is, what about national sovereignty in the 21st century? Brexit is an historical event going in an unexpected direction, compared with 70 years of increasing regional and global cooperation and with large international scientific literature about complex interdependence. It is a major historical event to be discussed beyond even relevant technical details, by a high-level confrontation of substantive arguments, through comparative research with other countries, and by deepening the historical background. Is asserting national sovereignty within the interdependent world of the 21st century realistic, given the transnational nature of the most of the challenges which the humankind and the nations are facing, from environment to economic imbalances, from poverty to development? Is the emphasis of national sovereignty the single or the best possible revival of politics, of political control against the economic determinism of the 90s, the domination of the economics of globalization, and of anonymous and democratic agencies beyond the state? The wave of sovereignism is not typical of the UK. In the United States, in Poland, in Hungary, in Italy, the various parties belonging to the nationalist wave were able to take over the office and are changing, sometimes profoundly, the international policy of their country. But in the case of the UK, we are witnessing something distinctive. the promised resurgence of democratic and constitutional, not illiberal, nationalism. The question whether it is fit to cope with the global context of the 21st century is an intellectual major challenge for social science, for our academy itself, who had along its best representative in the 30s, the great historian of Europe, Henri Pirenne, and they are experts in this room, and is since ever very committed to international cooperation. Second question, and I stop here. What about the future of regional multilateral cooperation after the Brexit? When looking with Brussels eyes, it's not a mystery, and this explains the maybe controversial title of our debate. I look to the paper by Professor Thoms. Many consider the UK current trend as a risk of isolationism, a largely artificial dispute with friends, and as I said, the opposite is a win-win game. But we all know that the idea of a global Britain that is a nation, a power willing to shape alone by its values and interests with allies, its relationship with within the international politics and the globalized economy, has been proposed by Prime Minister Theresa May as alternative to an isolationist scenario. How will the new UK understand regional and multilateral cooperation? In fact, even Donald Trump eventually reached a very Trumpian restyled kind of NAFTA yesterday with its neighbor, with a new name, putting the United States in evidence, of course. United States, Mexico, Canada arrangement. Regional cooperation matters, even for Trump. In fact, the United Kingdom leaders do not reject regional cooperation itself with neighbors. Also because almost, I would like to draw your attention, almost 50% of the UK exports are to the single market, while 10% of the European Union export are to the United Kingdom. But their understanding looks is similar to the idea of EFTA of this 1960, something similar to a free trade area, even if benefiting of some of the advantages of the European Union single market, which has been, however, constructed since the Treaty of Rome and the Single European Act, according to an alternative model of deeper regional integration, supranational, through the community method. Isn't the revival of the old European Union UK controversies of the 60s about regionalism challenging a large part of the multidisciplinary research in Europe and about regional studies, globalization studies? These topics are highly and increasingly controversial, and we actually don't know what will happen after March 2019, and which new relationship will be established between the UK and the European Union. We don't know what of and how will be revived of the other two circles of the famous Winston Churchill, three circles of the United Kingdom foreign policy: Europe, Commonwealth, and a special relationship with the United States. We are in an historically critical moment for the continent. We are entering with the Brexit to some extent in a terra incognita, in an unknown period of international relations. We all know that predicting the future is a tricky business. This profound uncertainty is the main reason why we decided to address these complex topics by an original way. Two presentations by excellent, internationally well-known Cambridge University professors, Professor Thoms and Professor Gamble. We thank them for accepting this game and making explicit why they don't share the same appreciation of the Brexit and its international implications. And now some words to introduce the two eminent speakers. Robert Thoms, born in 1949, is professor of Modern and European History at the St. John's College, University of Cambridge. Robert Thom's main area of research has been 19th century French political history. He has been particularly concerned with French nationalism from the 1830 to World War I, with a special attention to the Commune of Paris and the War of 71, to the famous Minister Thiers, and is also very committed to research on the Franco-British relations since the 18th century. He also worked on the history of the relation between the French and the British, defined as sweet enemies. In his book of 2006, published with his wife Isabelle Thoms, I welcome her in this room, traduit en français Les ennemis intimes, traduction de 2012, from the end of the 17th century to the present day. His most recent book, Professor Thoms, 1,000 pages, is published under the title The English and Their History in 2014 by Penguin Publisher. This book has been presented in 2016 as the history book of the year, a triumph, also because it presents a rich historical reconstruction and looks at the future of British identity in the light of Brexit. Professor Thoms deals with 2,000 years of English history, focusing on the Magna Carta, the UK as a kingdom, as an international power, as a nationality, and also as a cultural force. Shift to Professor Andrew Gamble. Professor Andrew Gamble, born in 1947, is since 2007 Professor of Politics at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of the Queen's College. He was also Director of the famous Police Department, the Department of Political Science. He was previously member of the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield, pupil of the Brighton College. He graduated at the Cambridge University and obtained in Cambridge his doctorate in social and political science. While he was at the Sheffield University, he was founder of the Center for Political Economic Research, chairman of the Department of Politics, and also pro-vice chancellor of the university. In 2000, he was elected member of the British Academy, section S5, Politics, Studies, Political Theory, Government, International Relations. In 2005, he was awarded with the Sir Isaiah Berlin Award for lifetime contribution to political studies. In 2003, his book Between Europe and America won the Mackenzie Prize for the best book published in political science in 2003. He is also co-editor of the academic journal Political Quarterly, and Professor Gamble has been joint editor of New Political Economy, a famous journal of the Sheffield University. Some of his books are truly the classics, as The Conservative Nation, Britain in Decline, Hayek, his famous reconstruction of the thought of Friedrich von Hayek, and so on. His most recent books are focusing on the economic and financial crisis 2007-2017. I remember The Spectre at the Feast, Crisis Without End, Can the Welfare Survive? Well, two exceptions, we have really the opportunity to hear today two exceptionally relevant speakers, and you will understand also why they did not vote in the same way in occasion of the Brexit referendum. Well, Mr. Thoms, you have the floor first. Thank you very much again for accepting the Royal Academy invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I was going to start in a very French way by saying, Monsieur le secrétaire perpétuel and so on, but perhaps I won't do that and just say, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for asking me here and for being here. Of course, I've been to Brussels before, but never before had I realized what a beautiful city it is and how worthy a city to be the capital of the European Union. I went to buy myself a souvenir T-shirt, Bruxelles, capitale de l'Europe, with all the flags of the member states, but not the British. The British had been removed, which made me think that people who make T-shirts are rather more decisive than British members of Parliament. I was asked to speak about Britain between isolationism and global status. If there's anything that can be stated with some confidence, even among the many uncertainties of Brexit, it is that Britain's decision to leave the European Union is not a move towards isolationism. I say this not merely because the arguments for Brexit are overwhelmingly globalist, but because isolationism, whether political or economic, is a very weak element in our political culture. Indeed, I would say it is scarcely present at all. Let me explain. One of the principal arguments for Brexit, heard throughout the referendum debate and since, is that it will permit closer economic relations with the non-European and developing world, free trade agreements with everyone, and faster and better than the EU. That has been the constant refrain. This isn't a new theme. Gordon Brown, when he was still Tony Blair's Chancellor of the Exchequer, pointed out that 80% of future trade growth for Britain would be outside the EU. There has been no strong opposing argument, whether from left or right, whatever their private thoughts. For example, it's logical that Jeremy Corbyn and the left wing of the Labour Party would not wish to enter into free trade agreements that would limit their ability to intervene in the economy, for instance, by state aids to industry. It's possible that elements of the Conservative Party would wish to protect agriculture. But neither has felt it politically possible to make a clear isolationist or protectionist case. I suggest it's a peculiarity of British history that the idea of free trade has long seemed a natural and desirable condition of commerce. This dates back to the campaign of the Anti-Corn Law League in the 1840s, which was still politically powerful in the early 20th century. No other country was so willing to practice free trade, including unilateral free trade, for so long, with the possible exception of Belgium. I'm not 100% sure. At a time when the United States, Germany, and France all practiced protectionism, Britain removed tariffs and quotas for its home market and also for its empire. This was seen by progressives as a moral cause, promoting peace, international harmony, political freedom, and prosperity. Only in the 1930s, under the impact of the Great Depression and a universal move towards high levels of protectionism, did Britain adopt imperial preference, a free trading system within the empire. This, you may say, is history, but it continues to have an influence. For example, no feature of the EU system has been so much criticised in Britain as the common agricultural policy, irrespective of whether Britain itself was a beneficiary. President Chirac once called it Britain's idée fixe. Agricultural protectionism has since the 1970s been criticised both on economic and moral grounds in Britain by both right and left, as damaging both to British consumers and to producers outside the EU, especially those in developing countries. No one in the present debate is suggesting establishing a post-Brexit version of the CAP for Britain, which it could quite easily do by continuing as a member of the customs union or by voluntarily continuing the high tariffs on agricultural products. But Brexiteers welcome cheap food imports from outside the EU, protecting domestic agriculture where necessary by giving financial aid in return for environmental improvement. This is partly a matter of sentiment and, as I suggested, of political culture, but it also reflects an economic reality. Britain has long been a global trader. Indeed, it has had no choice but to be one since at least the early 19th century because of the continuing growth in its population. It's now one of the most densely populated countries in Europe, but its dependence on imports of food and raw materials goes back to the time of Napoleon. Consequently, it has had to export globally. As the reforming Conservative Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel put it in the 1840s, one might on moral and social grounds prefer cornfields to cotton factories, but our lot is cast and we cannot recede. The cotton factories have mainly gone, and we depend now on exports of services. But that's nothing new either. Britain has had a regular deficit on visible trade, that is, trade in goods, since the 1830s, and has balanced its payments since then by global exports of services, centred, of course, on the City of London. The EU has proved of little benefit in this vital British interest. The single market only to a very limited extent covers services, and consequently Britain does less of its trade with the rest of the EU than any other member state. Moreover, the share of total British trade going to the rest of the EU has fallen by a quarter in 2 decades, and conversely, its trade with the rest of the world has been growing. Britain also invests twice as much outside the EU as inside it. Brexit both responds to these facts and is certain to accentuate them. I use economic policies as one test of whether Brexit means isolationism or globalism. But global Britain is not only an economic concept. I would suggest that the single thing that most clearly differentiates Britain from most, or perhaps even all other EU countries, is the range of its global connections. This is what prompted General de Gaulle to veto Britain's first application to join the common market in January 1963, though ironically, the only other European country that has a comparable global stance is France. The fact that English is a world language is both a consequence and a cause of these long-established global ramifications. The links exist at all levels of culture. They also exist at a human level. Huge numbers of British families have friends and relatives in other Anglophone countries, and one of those Anglophone countries, it should not be forgotten, is the second largest in the world, India. If we think of history, including popular historical ideas and myths, isolationism is not a feature of our history, our historical imagination over the last 200 or 300 years. Even the period of so-called splendid isolation of the late 19th century was not really such. It was a period during which Britain did not sign treaties, but it remained active in global and European affairs. Perhaps our greatest popular historical saga, indeed sometimes I think it's the only bit of history that people know anything about, is the Second World War, but only very briefly during late 1940 and early 1941. Could that in any way be seen as Britain in isolation? For one thing, the whole empire was involved, but our memory of the war, as indeed that of the First World War, is one of Britain as part of a broad alliance. This memory is the basis of the idea, which is partly, but not wholly imaginary, of a special relationship with the United States. Britain since 1945 has been almost continuously engaged in world politics, as a leading and staunch member of NATO, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and as a major participant, for better or worse, often for worse, in recent military action in the Balkans, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. Brexit will not alter this. Perhaps it will even accentuate it. Apart from a political and popular reluctance to get involved in more Middle Eastern quagmires, there is little or no sign of a move towards general isolationism, such as one sees in much of the EU. This kind of cultural and political globalism is often attacked by opponents of Brexit as nostalgia for empire, a significant theme in anti-Brexit propaganda. This seems to me mere polemic, and it's hard to know how seriously to take it. If there is any truth in it, it could only be that the empire was one aspect of the 18th and 19th century globalism that has, as I suggested earlier, had such an impact on British society and culture. But I see no sign of nostalgia, whether that word implies a desire to return to an imperial past, which is clearly absurd, or whether it implies something that is illusory and unreal. But clearly Britain's global engagement is neither illusory nor unreal. Let me give two examples. The 2018 Soft Power 30 Index, published by Portland Communications and the University of Southern California Center of Public Diplomacy, placed Britain first in terms of global soft power in 2018. Similarly, a recent report placed Britain as number 2 in the world after the United States in terms of what they called geopolitical capability, based on a combination of soft power, economic development, technology, and political and military effectiveness. Such analyses do not suggest a turn towards isolationism. Perhaps de Gaulle was right when he doubted that Britain would be willing to shut itself up in Europe, as he put it, at the cost of its wider interests. Many people would raise one particular objection to these arguments, the accusation that Brexit is a xenophobic, anti-immigrant reaction, and hence by definition isolationist. It's certainly true that control of immigration is an important issue, though the number of people who believe that immigration has been excessive in recent years is far larger than the number who voted for Brexit. But it would be a very dubious argument to equate a wish to control immigration with xenophobia, or else one would have to consider most of the population of Europe as xenophobic, including those in countries which are staunch supporters of the EU. As for Britain, opinion polls suggest a higher level of acceptance of existing immigrants and of ethnic diversity than in France, Germany, or even Belgium, for example. One should be very sceptical of propaganda on this issue, which has been endlessly repeated by extreme opponents of Brexit and echoed in the European media. Let me give you two precise examples which made headlines in Britain and beyond. One was the killing of a Polish man in Harlow in Essex in August 2016, which was immediately reported by the BBC as, I quote, post-Brexit rage. Jean-Claude Juncker went so far as to say that, I quote, we Europeans can never accept Polish workers being harassed, beaten up, and even murdered on the streets of Britain. Almost simultaneously, it was reported that a Polish cultural centre in London had the words, excuse my language, this is historical, the words, fuck you OMP, painted across its front doors. This was similarly reported as a racially motivated hate crime triggered by Brexit. What's the reality? In the case of the Polish man who died, it later emerged that he had previous police convictions and had started a fight late at night when drunk, allegedly making racist remarks, and he died after being punched by a 15-year-old boy and falling over and hitting his head, a tragic accident. As for the cultural centre, the OMP that was insulted was a Eurosceptic Polish think tank that had made a statement supporting Brexit. So the hate crime, if such there was by the anti-Brexit Poles. There are plenty of other cases that have been used unscrupulously to accuse those who voted Brexit of racism, and this has been a significant part in the anti-Brexit emotions. Opponents of Brexit find it very difficult to admit that the central issue is the EU. They prefer to ascribe the Leave vote to anger with the system, ignorance, xenophobia, and so on. But one can only understand Brexit by looking at the history of British relations with Europe and with the history of European integration itself. It begins during the interwar period, when certain individuals and small groups began to aspire to various schemes for supranational federations, whether based on empires or on the League of Nations or on various ideas of a United States of Europe. These were essentially consequences of the First World War. The Second World War and then the Cold War gave them a new importance. But Britain only became seriously interested after decolonisation. Its political elite was sensitive to what it saw as a loss of power and status. and that could be regained, it thought, by joining the European communities. This was essentially a conservative initiative. The British left was strongly opposed to what it saw as an undemocratic capitalist organisation. Parts of it still are. If nostalgia for empire does play a part in our relationship with Europe, it's here. Britain's rulers in the 1950s and 60s saw Europe as a substitute for lost empire, a way of not declining into merely a greater Sweden, as one of the official negotiators put it. So Britain joined the European communities at a time when its leaders felt weak and humiliated, but very few British politicians and even fewer British people were committed to a great European vision. Their experience of the 20th century had simply been less traumatic than that of the continent. Their motives, I'm afraid, were less lofty. To put it bluntly, vanity and economic advantage. As I pointed out earlier, the economic advantages were not great. Indeed, it's not clear that there have been any at all. British economic growth did not increase after it joined the EEC, and during the 1980s, British economic performance overtook the EU average. The British people have been in various ways aware of this, and in the last 10 years or so have become increasingly conscious of Eurozone problems affecting Southern and Eastern Europe. The general lack of public enthusiasm, and here I'm cutting a long story short, meant that despite Tony Blair's willingness, the country had not joined the euro. This was crucial. Whatever historical and cultural divergence there may have been between Britain and most of the EU, as Eurobarometer polls showed year after year, had we been in the Eurozone, it's arguable that we would never have voted to leave in 2016. The EU was, after all, as unpopular in several other member countries as it was in Britain, even more so as, for example, in Greece. But being in the Eurozone meant that leaving was much too dangerous, or at least so it seemed. Britain's leave vote in 2016 was therefore a consequence of circumstance, not being in the Eurozone, as well as possible longer-term issues. The 2016 vote has caused, or perhaps aggravated, divisions in Britain that I think few, if any, people expected, at least in their intensity. This is something that future historians will no doubt study. The division between leavers and remainers has regional, socio-economic, cultural and generational elements, but it does not closely follow the traditional political parameters of left and right, Labour and Tory. Our present turbulence is comparable with the conflict over the abolition of the Corn Laws in 1846, which I mentioned earlier, and with that over Irish Home Rule in the 1880s, both of which split existing parties and reshaped the political landscape, and that is still certainly a possibility. One of the most original and influential insights into the general cultural phenomenon is a book by David Goodhart describing what he calls somewhere people and anywhere people. Somewhere people who feel part of a local or national community, and anywhere people who feel unattached. And this explains much of the Remain-Leave division. Ben Copley has pointed out that the anti-Brexit ideology is closely related to the left-wing politics of identity, which in this case creates a negative image of Brexit as associated with unfavoured identities, including male, white and working class, and particularly the ethnically English working class. It's striking that this Remainer ideology has very little to do with the EU and its institutions and seems unconcerned with the actual state of Europe. It's a largely inward-looking mentality, I think, which is a paradox considering its self-image of cosmopolitanism. But however interesting it is to deconstruct the Remainer ideology, one should not overestimate its electoral importance. Ideological Remainers probably amount to around 5% of the population. On the day of the referendum, only 9% of the Remain voters, and hence around 4% of the total who voted, said that their prime motivation was, I quote, a strong attachment to the EU and its shared history, culture and traditions. More important and influential are those I would term professional Remainers, drawn from business, the professions, politics and the civil service, and most numerous of all, those I would call worried Remainers. Most who voted Remain said they did so primarily because they were worried about the possible economic consequences. Similar fears have been promoted in other EU countries, notably Greece, Italy and France, and have the effect of stifling anti-EU sentiment even in countries most damaged by membership. The worried group is probably around a third of the total electorate, and hence 2/3 of the Remain vote. How disruptive in the long term is this division in the country? It depends on how Brexit is managed. If pessimistic forecasts prove unfounded, the country will probably recover fairly quickly. The Brexit vote, after all, was one in favour of national institutions, the feature that most clearly distinguishes it from some populist movements elsewhere, for example in the United States. But if Brexit is either blocked or proves a disaster, we can expect continuing political upheavals that will affect Britain's relationship with its European neighbours and its global role. Far less easy to speculate about is Britain's future strategic and political role. This depends very much on the inner circles of politics and foreign policy, which largely support Remain. Their hope has been to diverge as little as possible from the EU and attach Britain after Brexit to EU structures, such as PESCO, which Professor Telò mentioned. However, the announcement at the time of writing that Britain is seriously considering a rival satellite system to the EU's Galileo may be a sign that this is not going to happen. No doubt Britain will seek to rebuild its relationship with the USA, especially after Trump, and with the Five Eyes Commonwealth security partners. There's a strong lobby within the Conservative Party for an increase in defence spending to consolidate the UK's traditional position as NATO's number 2. It will be important to see whether a new generation of post-Brexit politicians and diplomats can create an independent British role or will simply fall back on the USA. But to conclude, all this, indeed nearly everything I've said, could be changed unpredictably by something I have not yet mentioned, a Labour election victory bringing Jeremy Corbyn to Downing Street. If that happened, which I do not really believe, our relations with both the EU and the Anglosphere would be in the balance. That is the only circumstance that I can see in which Britain might, in the short term, move in the direction of isolation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure and honour to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Brussels, and it's always a pleasure to be in Belgium. I was, in fact, in Belgium last week when I came with my two brothers. We visited the place near Ypres where my grandfather was shot down on September the 27th, 1918, and he survived the crash, but his co-pilot, who was 19, was killed. And we went to see the grave, and we left a wreath. And then we attended the wonderful Menin Gate, the ceremony which takes place every night, and the sounding of the last post. So I want to talk about Brexit this evening. And my first question is, will the Brexit vote come to be seen as a major watershed in British political history, marking the rebirth of a confident, outward-looking and enterprising sovereign nation, or as one of the triggers for a new phase of decline, in which Britain turns inward and its energies are absorbed by internal conflicts as it struggles to define a new place for itself in the world? The evidence we have is mixed, but there are worrying signs it may be the latter rather than the former. There are very few completely isolated societies left in the modern world. The decision by the shogun in 1635 to close the borders of Japan in a bid to eradicate foreign influence was maintained for 3 centuries. No one supposes that Brexit was a vote for that kind of isolation, although Private Eye, the British satirical magazine, had a lot of fun with the rather eccentric plans drawn up by the Hard Brexit European Research Group. Private Eye suggested these plans might include filling in Eurotunnel with cement, banning European flags from the last night of the proms, and getting the SAS to seize the Bayeux tapestry, returning it to Hastings to be restitched to show King Harold taking back control and sending the Normans back to where they came from. Isolationism is not really the issue. It is whether Britain becomes more closed or more open after Brexit. In the modern era, all societies have become increasingly interdependent, both culturally and economically. Politics has remained much more fragmented, with states claiming exclusive jurisdictions over particular territories and identities, and identities are still powerfully associated with national communities. This tension between global interdependence and national sovereignty, reflected in the domestic politics of every country, has become one of the key challenges of our times, and the growth of international cooperation through multilateral institutions in attempting to meet this challenge has been one of the most significant developments in the last 70 years. Brexit as a political process in the UK needs to be understood on at least two levels, the popular level and the elite level. Membership of the European Union was never an issue with high salience for British voters, and many were surprised to be asked to vote in a referendum. By contrast, it has been an all-consuming issue for most of the political class, particularly the Conservative Party. The survey evidence shows that the main reason people voted Leave was because they wanted their country, their region, their town, and their neighbourhoods to be more predictable, less subject to change, and in particular, less subject to the change from the arrival of strangers, particularly strangers with different cultures. The Brexit vote at the popular level was a demand for a more closed country, particularly in respect of immigration, but also in respect of many of the changes associated with globalization, such as the decline of traditional industries and the introduction of new technologies. Voting against the EU was a way to vote against the political class, against immigration, against globalization, and against openness. The passions which the vote unleashed on the Leave side were predominantly in favour of a more closed society and a wish to disengage from international cooperation and the institutions through which it is organised. At the elite level, it was very different. The debate was predominantly about Britain's place in the world and about different ways of achieving openness and whether membership of the EU makes Britain a more or a less open society. The divide runs very deep, particularly in the Conservative Party, although earlier it was Labour which was more divided on the issue. The two referendums on Europe in 1975 and 2016 were both held as a way of managing internal divisions within the governing party, Labour in 1975, the Conservatives in 2016. The rejection of the government's advice in 2016 has plunged Britain into a constitutional crisis and a political deadlock because the narrow majority in favour of Leave in the popular vote has to be implemented by a parliament, a civil service and a business community, all of which voted heavily to remain. For the first time in British history, popular sovereignty has become disconnected from parliamentary sovereignty. Over the last 2 years, the complexity of the task of disentangling the UK from the European Union after 40 years of membership has become painfully apparent. It took 2 years for the British government even to table a proposal, the Chequers Plan, which triggered the resignation of key ministers, denunciations in several Conservative newspapers, and threats by 80 Conservative MPs to vote it down in Parliament. One observer has speculated that Theresa May, this is Rachel Sylvester in the Times, that Theresa May is torn between her promise to deliver Brexit and her growing realisation that Brexit is a disastrous mistake. The inability of any plan to command majority support within Parliament or the governing party has produced an extraordinary atmosphere in British politics. Some commentators describe it as a collective nervous breakdown, comparable to the Suez Crisis in 1956. The rest of the EU has watched with incredulity as a country once known for the pragmatism and moderation of its politics and the governing competence of its political class is sucked into a morass of incompetence, ideological division, and deadlock. Much of the British political class is still in shock about Brexit, because Brexit upends one of the pillars of the consensus about Britain's place in the world, which was forged after the humiliation of Suez. Winston Churchill in 1946 pictured Britain as being at the centre of three overlapping circles: Empire, Anglo-America, and Europe. Churchill thought that Britain could remain a global power if it kept a foot in all three. But this was quickly shown to be unrealistic. The pressures to withdraw from empire, the recognition at Suez that Britain could no longer act strategically independently of the United States, and the relative decline of the British economy relative to its European neighbours forced change. When Dean Acheson, one of the chief architects of the post-war liberal international order, declared that Britain had lost an empire but not yet found a role, Harold Macmillan agreed with him and initiated a major shift of direction, accelerating the withdrawal from empire, modernising the British economy, and making the first application to join the common market. The bid did not succeed for 12 years, but in that time, the British Conservative Party, under Edward Heath, became strongly committed to a European future for Britain, and imperialist and nationalist critics were marginalised. Macmillan saw Britain's participation in the European community as complementing and strengthening the Western alliance, a view which every US president, until the present incumbent, has shared. The rules-based liberal international order, of which the EU was an essential building block, became the modern expression of Britain's traditional global policy. The new elite consensus was ratified by the 1975 referendum, yet during 43 years as a member of the European community, Britain never became fully committed. Britain was often referred to as the awkward partner. It opted out of the ERM, it opted out of Schengen, it opted out of the euro. British Conservative ministers were influential in the creation of a single market and in advocating the eastward expansion of the Union, but then British Conservative politicians and newspapers railed against the consequences. Part of the British political class never accepted or understood the character of Europe as a rules-based order. That incomprehension has continued into the negotiations on Brexit. As Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, put it at the Salzburg summit, before they were in and they had many opt-outs, now they want to be out with many opt-ins. To many Europeans, Britain has always been inconsistent, often obtuse in its approach to Europe. Many have concluded, like Jacques Telò in 2012, that perhaps it would be better for everyone if Britain agreed to move to an associate status. There are some deep reasons in British history for this failure to engage. Ever since Henry VIII broke with Rome, declaring that England was an empire, an independent sovereign power which could order its affairs in whatever way it chose, Europe has often been cast as the other, against which England and then Britain came to define their identity. The pre-democratic doctrine of the unlimited sovereignty of Crown in Parliament has proved hard to reconcile with the idea of the pooling of sovereignty, which is at the heart of the EU and of every other multilateral treaty-based organisation. If Britain is not to be a member of the great union on its doorstep, what is the alternative? For many years, the choice has been framed as a choice between Europe and America. Britain should be part of Anglo-America and the Anglosphere, not Europe. This idea has a long tradition in British politics, going back to ideas of Greater Britain and Imperial Federation at the end of the 19th century and Atlantic Union in the 20th. Support for the new liberal international order created by the Americans since 1945 has been a cornerstone of British policy. The disagreement in the political class between Leavers and Remainers is whether that is best achieved through membership of the EU or outside it. Remainers think that the Anglosphere is a mirage, and the best way for Britain to be an open country and maximise its international influence is to be a member of the EU, the most successful experiment in creating a multilateral regional rules-based order anywhere in the world, and a crucial support for the wider rules-based international order which the British have always sought to promote. Before 1945, as Robert has mentioned, the Conservative Party was the protectionist party in British politics, opposing the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, which ended protection of British agriculture, and embracing tariff reform and protection between 1906 and 1940. One of the features of the Brexit debate is that there has been no revival of this conservative protectionist tradition. The advocates of global Britain are passionate free traders. Economists for Brexit, a pro-Brexit lobby group, even advocate that Britain unilaterally abolishes all tariffs regardless of what other countries do. Less bold conservative leavers prefer a free trade agreement with the EU, the Canada option, or to trade on WTO terms, if the WTO survives Donald Trump. In either case, Britain would have to restructure large parts of its economy and would have to negotiate its own trade deals. The prospects of success for such a strategy in a world in which trade wars and closed regional blocs are once again on the rise are not high. But this is not just a trade policy. It is to be accompanied by a sweeping programme of tax cuts and deregulation, targeting in particular workers' rights, environmental controls, wealth taxes and corporation taxes. Immigration, although now controlled, would continue at high levels to keep labour markets flexible and wages low. Such policies might help secure a US trade deal by removing EU regulations and standards which the US finds irksome. But this is not what a majority of Leave voters voted for or were promised. Many of them were expecting that Brexit would deliver fewer immigrants, greater security, higher wages, less inequality, and above all, less globalisation. Many conservative Brexiters, however, argue that Britain will not derive any benefit from Brexit unless it delivers a sharp shock to force British companies and workers to become more competitive and enterprising. Global Britain faces two main problems. There are firstly the severe practical difficulties of making it work better than the close partnership with the EU. Almost every study of the economic impact of Brexit show that it will make Britain significantly poorer and that new trading relationships to replace those lost will be very hard to establish. Secondly, it will be very difficult to create a new elite consensus around global Britain or to win popular support for it. Majorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland want no part in it. Just at the moment, the Conservatives' hard Brexit faction is on the brink of winning the party's long civil war. Brexit is unleashing forces which threaten to take Britain in a very different direction to global Britain. There are four main possible outcomes of the Brexit negotiations, even at this very late stage. They could end in a no deal, a limited Canada free trade deal, a Norway-style deal, or a decision by Britain after a second referendum to suspend Article 50 and remain. The first two will leave Britain significantly worse off than now. The more honest leavers acknowledge that the consequences of their vision would be extinction of the last sectors of British industry and a very painful period of adjustment. Jacob Rees-Mogg has admitted that the real benefits of a hard Brexit might take 50 years to emerge. Support for more austerity, more inequality, more globalisation is unlikely to win many electoral majorities in the current climate. support is more likely to flow to parties which promise to protect citizens from the economic difficulties which Brexit will create. If there was a no deal, it could produce a severe economic shock and political crisis. But even a Canada deal will also see a weakening of the economy, at least in the short term. Both are likely to accelerate the breakup of the UK and to boost support for Corbyn's left Labour Party and make it more likely that it will win an election, blaming the Conservatives for the economic situation arising from Brexit. Theresa May warned about this in her speech to the Conservative Party conference this morning. A Corbyn government will make Britain less open to the rest of the world by disengaging from many of Britain's external economic and security commitments to concentrate on its experiment in national economic planning. If the May government manages to avoid either no deal or a Canada-style option, it will have to propose either membership of the European Economic Area or something close to it, or remaining in the EU with or without a second referendum. Either outcome will be denounced as a betrayal and will fuel a furious reaction. The Conservative Party might well split, and if it did not, many Brexiters would be tempted to join a new xenophobic, populist, nationalist party of the kind Steve Bannon favours. The alternative is remaking the Conservatives as a Britain First party and purging its moderates. These are the unhappy consequences of a civil war in the Conservative Party, which has now been going on for 3 decades. It has destroyed 3 Conservative prime ministers and is well on its way to claiming a 4th. It is starting to realign British politics. 70% of those who supported the Conservative Party in the general election in 2017 had voted Remain in the referendum, up from 57% in the referendum itself. The new cleavage lines in British politics lie between graduates and non-graduates, young and old, big cities and smaller towns, white English and black British. The Conservative Party is becoming detached from the most dynamic sectors of British business and British civil society, and from its youth, a large majority of whom backed Remain. The Conservatives have become the party of older voters, small towns and the countryside. Despite David Cameron's attempts to make his party more liberal and open, 57% of those who voted Conservative in the 2015 election voted Leave in the referendum. This was decisive in swinging the vote to Leave. They were not voting, I suggest, for a more open Britain. Cameron was backed by a majority of his cabinet and a small majority of his MPs, but he did not have majority support from Conservative members, Conservative voters, or Conservative newspapers. The Sun, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and the Daily Express had given unrelentingly negative, biased, and abusive coverage of the EU for the previous 25 years. The surge in populist nationalism that has been taking place across Europe and in the United States since the 2008 financial crash is also an important factor in Brexit. Steve Bannon has called for the formation of a global Tea Party, the movement, linking together the populist nationalists in Europe and the United States. They denounce the political class as corrupt and self-serving. They oppose immigration, particularly from Muslim countries, and they want to take back control of their countries from the foreigners, liberals, cosmopolitans, and anyone who favours cultural openness and multilateral cooperation. In the UK, the main vehicle for populist nationalism so far has been UKIP, the UK Independence Party. The referendum was only conceded by David Cameron because UKIP was threatening to take away Conservative voters and Conservative MPs. UKIP was pivotal both in getting the referendum and in winning it. Many Conservatives refused to work with UKIP, so the Leave campaign was Hydra-headed. Vote Leave, run by Conservative Brexiters, campaigned for global Britain and gave priority to the issue of sovereignty, while Leave EU, run by UKIP, focused on immigration. There was no unified manifesto or programme, so it was impossible for voters to know what they were voting for when they voted Leave. The main reason Brexit is unlikely to deliver the global Britain of which conservative leavers dream is because it has unleashed and strengthened new radical forces on both the left and right. The old centre has shrunk. Support is flowing away from social democrats and liberal conservatives towards either populist nationalism on the right or Corbynite socialism on the left. The Brexit process has given legitimacy to the Corbyn leadership and consolidated its hold on the Labour Party. The divisions in the Conservative Party run so deep that a Corbyn government has become a real possibility, particularly if there is a chaotic no-deal Brexit. Corbyn leads a party which has a mass membership now of over 500,000, 86% of whom want a people's vote on the Brexit deal the government negotiates, and 90% of whom would vote to remain in the EU. Corbyn himself, however, and his key allies support Brexit and do not want to see Britain remain in the EU. Their vision is that of Tony Benn and the Labour left in the 1980s, who wanted to build a protectionist socialist Britain, cutting off ties with the EU, NATO, and all the multilateral institutions of the post-war world order. If the Conservative Party does not split, it is likely to become a party of Britain first rather than global Britain, to ward off the threats from Corbynism and from populist nationalism. The signs of this are already visible. The present government is already implementing much tighter checks for non-EU citizens, which is significantly both impeding and deterring the flow of foreign nationals to Britain's universities and companies. Another reason why Britain seems destined to turn inward after Brexit and become less open is because Westminster governments will have to devote much time to saving their own union. Of the four nations which make up the United Kingdom, England and Wales voted for leave, but Scotland and Northern Ireland voted remain. Opinion in Scotland and Northern Ireland has hardened since the referendum. Recent polls in Northern Ireland show that 70% now support remaining in the EU, compared to 56% who voted Remain 2 years ago. There is now a small majority of Northern Ireland citizens who would vote to leave the UK and join a united Ireland if a hard Brexit goes ahead. The right to such a poll is part of the Good Friday Agreement, but holding one is fraught with peril for the peace process. In Scotland, the growing gulf between Scottish and English identity has been further exacerbated by the possibility of a hard Brexit. Polls show that it has significantly increased support for independence. Another independence referendum at some stage in the future looks inevitable. Brexit will not be seen as a moment which strengthened the Union, but rather a moment which strengthened the forces seeking to break it up. The period between 1979 and 2007, dominated first by Margaret Thatcher and then by Tony Blair, may yet come to be seen as an interlude between two periods of decline. This is a suggestion of Philip Collins in the Times. The first covering the withdrawal from empire, and the second the breakup of the United Kingdom. On a brighter note, the lurch towards a more closed Britain, which Brexit, I feel, represents, will one day be reversed, either by the rise of a new centrist party or by internal change within the Labour and Conservative parties. The rising generations in all parts of the UK want a more open Britain and voted by large majorities for Remain. At some stage after Brexit, UK governments will tentatively start exploring ever closer engagement with the EU once again. In the meantime, some of the leaders of the Leave campaign might reflect on lines written by Rudyard Kipling, Epitaph for a Statesman, about the First World War. I could not dig, I dared not rob, therefore I lied to please the mob. Now all my lies are proved untrue, and I must face the men I slew. What tale shall serve me here among mine angry and defrauded young? Remainers might ponder words written by John Maynard Keynes at about the same time in The Economic Consequences of the Peace. England still stands outside Europe. Europe's voiceless tremors do not reach her. Europe is apart, and England is not of her flesh and body. but Europe is solid with herself. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, both of the speakers. Now we proposed already to the two speakers, they accepted a new rule of the game to have a quick exchange, a short exchange between the two speakers. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Thoms for a short feedback. Particularly the main issue is the credibility. How realistic is the global Britain perspective? According to Gamble, it's not realistic and will produce negative effect domestically and internationally. You have the floor, Professor Thoms. Please.
Shall I? I don't know if this is on. Right. Well, Andrew certainly made your flesh creep. This is, even by Remainer standards, an unusually pessimistic analysis. Global Britain is not possible because Britain is a country in decline. This is the sort of story that I was brought up with the same generation. In fact, Britain is not in decline and has not been in decline. Economically, politically, we're very much in the position we've always been in. Economically, well, as I pointed out, our trade with the EU has been declining as a proportion of our total global commerce since the end of the last century, and will continue to do so. Indeed, a forecast I've seen by a reputable Oxford forecasting company has shown that on present trends, our trade with the EU will continue to decline whether or not we're members, until it reaches the point it was at before we joined the EU. Our trade with the rest of the world is in surplus. Our trade with the EU is constantly in deficit. There's no reason economically to worry, even in the short term, though recent forecasts I've seen suggest that there might be a drop of about 0.5% or 1% in GDP for over about 18 months. The idea that this will be a watershed in our whole political history seems to me to be simply an exaggeration. Why is it thought that it's impossible for Britain to have contacts with the rest of the world, both economic and political? Only, I think, if you take an extremely pessimistic view of what the country is, what its people are, what its capacities are, which I think Andrew does and I don't. But the other half of the equation, of course, is the EU. Now, I expect it's the case here that most of you are firm supporters of the EU. But think of what the position that the EU is in today. It's in a state of flux, and that's to use a rather mild word. Some people might say it's in a state of permanent crisis. It's very difficult to say what the EU will be in 10 years' time, even if it will still exist in its present form. I'm not sure I'm quite as pessimistic as President Macron is about the future, but as you know, he thinks the only chance for Europe to survive is if it becomes, in effect, a sovereign state with control over most of the areas of government. It seems to me that that will not happen, but if it did happen, it would make things worse. So what will the EU be? We don't know. But the argument that Andrew has put forward assumes a Britain in chaos and an EU that is solid. It seems to me that the two things are much more similar. We have a Britain whose future is uncertain, because the future is always uncertain, and we have an EU whose future is also uncertain. If the EU continues to go in the direction that Macron advocates, which, as I say, I doubt if it will, Britain would not want to be part of that. And indeed, no political party would support it. So sooner or later, we would have had to make a choice. There would have been a referendum, and we would have voted not to go ahead towards a sovereign Europe. That it happened in 2016 was a political fluke, but it would have happened sooner or later, I think. On the other hand, if Europe continues to suffer periodic financial and economic crises, and if it fails to solve the problem of immigration, then it's very unlikely that Europe will be an attractive prospect in a few years' time, as Andrew suggests. he pointed out that the majority vote in the referendum was very small. It was, though it was a majority in about 2/3 of all parliamentary constituencies, and had it been a parliamentary vote, it would have caused a landslide in favour of leave. But don't forget these circumstances. Almost the government, the opposition, most of the press, most of the media put huge pressure on the electorate to vote to remain. Nevertheless, it voted to leave. The real majority for leave, I would say, is very much greater than the nominal majority that showed in the referendum.
Thank you.
Shall I?
Thank you very much. So if Athens is suffering, Sparta doesn't laugh. Well, you believe in the strengths, economic strengths of the UK for making the global Britain perspective credible. Please, Andrew, you make the same, giving a feedback to Professor Thoms. Take this one.
Yes, I suppose, I mean, I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I think realistic is what I was trying to be. I mean, the British civil service, which have been looking at every possible option for Britain after Brexit, they haven't come up with anything so far within the civil service. They can't find any possibility that will make Britain better off than it is with current arrangements. And I think that's the problem is how much damage is Brexit going to do? And a lot of the political debate is around that. And the reason why I think there's a political and constitutional crisis is because the governing party is clearly unable to come to an agreed view on what that future should be, and there isn't a way of getting a majority within the Parliament unless Theresa May was prepared to act like Robert Peel and split her party and create a new parliamentary majority. That isn't Theresa May's style of politics. She is desperately trying to limit the damage from Britain's exit from the EU and to try and find a way that holds her party together. But at this point, it's very difficult to know whether she can succeed in doing that. So, I mean, I've got no worries about the strength and resilience of Britain as an economy. Of course, Britain can adjust to even what Brexit can cause. I mean, the loss in output that has been caused to the British economy from the years since the financial crash in 2008 is twice as great as any effect from Brexit. The difficulty is that the damage from Brexit is going to come on top of the effects of the 2008 crash, the austerity, the rising inequality, and the stagnation of wages and living standards over that time. And I think that's the problem, and that the danger that I see is of why Britain might turn inward is because I think the political debate is going to become monopolised by those both on left and right who want to focus on internal questions, and that's going to be the difficulty for Britain going forward.
Thank you very much. So the debate is open. The floor is to you. I see many people want to take the floor. We have had the good news is you see everybody how pluralist the Cambridge research community is. Huh? Well, we start with Professor Van Parijs, member of the Academy. Philippe, you would like to come here? Come here.
My name is Philippe Van Pares. I'm a member of this academy, but also a fellow of the British Academy. And more relevant still, I've been for 40 years the spouse of a British citizen who I met more or less at the time, or in Oxford, more or less at the time of the first referendum. First, congratulations on your typically British phlegmatic presentations on a very emotional subject. Here is my question. Your Brexit secretary this week said, history will judge Brexit as a springboard to a buccaneering global embrace of free trade. We'll be delivering Brexit to expand our global horizons so we attract the best and the brightest from around the world. Okay. My question to you is, to both of you, what advice would you give to the European Union in order to protect this, so that it can protect itself against this buccaneering state, this pirate state across the channel that will try to compete by lowering tariffs, by going for tax competition, as Andrew Gamble mentioned, by cherry-picking on immigration, taking the brightest and the best while leaving all the riffraff to the European Union, and thereby also increasing the huge brain drain at the expense of EU 27, which currently exists. 600,000 people form the brain drain in the UK at the expense of the EU. What advice to the EU to protect itself against this buccaneering state?
Thank you, Philippe, very much. I would like you to take note of the answer. We do collect 4 questions, and please, you.
Thank you. My name is Didier. I'm the president of the European Humanist Federation. And at the beginning of this debate, it was said that one of the features of the debate on Brexit was that the Remain side focused on practical things. I think Professor Telò said this, whereas the Leave side was much more focused on ideal and identity or nationalist questions. Now, you know, the British model has been for a couple of centuries the model for what was used to be called the free world. You had the Bill of Rights 1 century before the US and France. And it was upon that model that many of our institutions in many of our countries were built. And it was even explicit in our country, for example, Italy. This was extremely obvious. In the last decades, the Soviet Union was the identity provider that was the alternative to this. Nowadays, there is another alternative worldwide that is freedom, prosperity without freedom. That is the model that in the global scene is the opposite to what used to be called the free world. Now, don't you think that this should push all our countries, the intellectuals, the political systems and so on, to renew their demands for a global free world, as the neoconservatives did on the other side a couple of decades ago in the US? And it was the first dismantling operations for what used to be called the free world. I think that there is a new Trésor de Clerc from this point of view that is going on, and we should repair it. Thank you very much.
Second, also very good question. You, please.
Stasinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission. And my question relates with the complexity of the existing institutional framework in the trade field. And there is no doubt that the UK, with a tradition in open trade, will continue along those lines. But how realistic is to expect, let's say, UK to obtain again the global status in the trade field, given the complexity of the existing framework? UK is a member of the WTO. WTO has a membership of near 200 countries. UK has negotiated a very large number of agreements. And in order to become again a great global player in trade, he has to renegotiate that. What's the capacity, I would say, the institutional capacity, this to happen quite quickly?
Paul-Henri Hennen from the Academy in Brussels. I'm a scientific, and I'm coming from a small country, so I have no doubt that we have no weight in the world and we will not be able to really change negotiation. I have doubt that ex-big countries like France or the United Kingdom have a very large weight too. And two of the main problems that I see in the future, which are really problems that we will have to deal with, are climate change and also the production of farms goods in an ecological way and to preserve the health of people. Now, we see how the United States is following a path that we do not like. European Union with its big market has a small chance to have some weight in negotiation and to impose some rules to preserve the climate and the ecology. Do you think that the UK will not be just following what Trump will say and what the US will be doing, because you will not have the strength to change his path?
Okay, thank you very much for 4 brilliant questions. Then we will have a second tour, I propose. Let's change the order. First Andrew, and then Robert Thoms. Andrew Gamble.
Yes, well, the 4 very good questions. The what advice to the EU? I think if the hard Brexit vision was implemented, then it's sometimes called Britain being sort of Singapore, the Singapore model. Then clearly that would create some severe problems for the EU. But I tend to think that it's not likely to develop quite in that fashion, because I think the EU is still going to have tremendous negotiating power in relation to the UK. There's still going to be so many things, as we see from these negotiations, that the UK wants in terms of access to Europe, that many of the things that the EU will be able to use its power and the dependence of Britain on the EU, which will remain whatever policy Britain adopts. It will enable it to reduce the effects of a buccaneering Britain. On the question of the rise of prosperity without freedom, I mean, I've always thought of the EU as a league of democracies. The kind of vision which Immanuel Kant had, and it's one of the main components of the free world, which has existed since 1945. So I think that anything which weakens that league of democracies is a very bad idea. And it's also, I think, very necessary that people that believe in the values of open democracies, that they do actually band together in defense of their ideals and their values. Because there are some very ugly forces now which are ranged against them. On the question of how realistic it is, this is perhaps where Robert and I most disagree, whether Britain can regain its status as a global trader. I think the situation is completely different from the 19th century, the last time Britain was a serious global trader. I just don't think that Britain had, of course, its protected empire At that time, it was the leading commercial, financial, and for a long time industrial power, financial power. The pound sterling was the international currency. Britain's move to complete free trade after 1846 was a gesture of strength. Britain isn't in anything like that position today. And I think I'm always puzzled by the argument that these free trade deals are going to be so much easier to negotiate outside the EU than inside the EU. And if you look at, if it was the EU that was holding back Britain from being a global trader, how do we explain that Germany, for instance, is one of the few countries in the world which has a trade surplus with China? Britain, of course, has a very large deficit with China, but there's nothing in EU rules which have prevented Germany from succeeding in trading with China and wouldn't have prevented Britain. Only now it's going to be much harder for Britain to get the kind of deals it wants because its clout is clearly going to be much less than it had when it was part of the EU in trade negotiations. And which is my answer to the final point as well. I think that Britain is bound to have less power as a negotiator. Britain, of course, is still a significant economy, but it will clearly have less power in negotiating, particularly with the very big economies of the world, like the United States, like China, and like India, increasingly, than it would have if it was negotiating with all other 27 members of the EU.
Thank you. Professor Thoms?
Thank you. It's kind of you to have said that Cambridge is a very pluralist place, as we have shown, but I'm afraid it's not quite as pluralist as you might think. Two of the young Cambridge scholars who are greatest specialists on EU policy, both of whom support Brexit, have come under a huge amount of pressure not to express their views publicly. And quite a number of young academics feel only able to do so anonymously, because the weight of opinion within academe is so strongly pro-Remain that they feel, and I think rightly, that their careers would be endangered if they made their views known. So pluralism is not quite as one would hope. Now, the springboard, what should the EU do? Well, I guess what it's doing now, which is to try to keep us in the customs union by using the issue of the Irish border as a lever. And clearly that's part of the intention, is to prevent a more effective competitor. Trade. Can Britain be a global trader? Well, it is a global trader. Of course, I mean, comparing it with the 1850s is not really very helpful, because the period between about 1830 and 1860 was an extremely abnormal period. We have been a trader as a relatively small country, or a medium-sized country. We've been a successful global trader for several hundred years, and as I think Andrew admitted, will remain so unless, of course, some dreadful catastrophe happens for the future. Being inside or outside the EU probably makes quite a small difference. As was said, the issue was one of principle, not of practicality. In much of the campaign on the Remain side was a negative one, saying, well, yes, the EU's pretty awful, but leaving it's even worse. On the Leave side, it was largely a question of democratic accountability, of which various issues were important, of which immigration was one. But the question of democracy was at the heart of it. The EU is certainly, as Andrew said, a league of democracies, but it's not itself a democratic structure. And that is, of course, I say of course, I think it seems to me quite clear that is a major reason for the growth of populist movements of an extreme kind within the EU. It's not possible to to oppose EU policy from within. One can only oppose the EU as such, and that's what's happening more and more. That's part of the flaw of the system. It was created deliberately to be a non-electoral, or if you prefer, post-democratic system, which is fine as long as it doesn't do very much. As long as it's like the WTO or NATO, it has strict limits, or EFTA, no one minds it not being democratic. Once it claims to be sovereign, then the fact that it's not democratic matters hugely. Now, why did the British think this more important than other people did? Well, I leave that to you to decide. It seems to me, I know more about France than I do about Britain, really. And it's always struck me as strange that the French, with such a strong sense of republican democratic legitimacy, seem to be quite happy to give away, indeed lead the movement to give away their democratic accountability to a supranational institution. But I think the answer to that is they, A, are terrified of the consequences of it failing, and B, because they think they'll be in charge of it, or at least they hope they will. The future, we don't know what the future is, and therefore to project far into the future is a fantasy game. Shall we have less power as a negotiator on our own than as 1/28th of a larger negotiator? It seems to me that doesn't follow at all. Small countries seem to be quite successful. It's widely believed in Europe, I know, that the day of the nation state is over, and that the only way forward is through some great supranational organization, but nowhere else in the world does this seem to be believed. And nowhere else in the world is this a trend. What worries me about the future of Europe is that by holding the lid down on what is a boiling vessel, that sooner or later there will be some sort of explosion. Indeed, minor explosions are already happening. It's not very glorious for the British to have backed out and said, look, we don't like the way things are going, we're going to leave. But the idea that Britain could, as many Remainers think, have reformed Europe in some democratic direction seems to me to be an illusion. And if you don't agree with the way things are being done, it's only honest, it seems to me, to say we no longer wish to be part of this. And when I travel in parts of Europe, especially in southern Europe, and I've been to Greece twice recently, the effects on Greek society and on the Greek economy, on the structure of life in Greece, of the euro system, of the way it's been treated by the EU authorities, seems to me to be completely immoral and foolish. Okay, Greece is small and therefore it doesn't matter. But I don't myself really want to be part of an organization that does this to small countries. So for me it was largely a moral or an ethical issue. And I would have supported it, I think, even had I thought it would make me poorer. But I don't actually think it will.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is very much to discuss, but I would like to give the floor to two more. Oh, we have finally a lady there, please, there at the end of the room, and then a second one. I would say two more interventions, then we have to close because of time limits.
Thank you so much.
Introduce yourself, please.
I would introduce myself. The lady is a former student of Mario Telò, and we also had the pleasure to work together for a lot of years in the past. My name is Anna Cristina Costea. I work for the European Union, and I came tonight because I also wanted to see this new vision of the world that we will have after the Brexit. My question will be actually related to what both speakers said about the change of generation. I like when I go to conferences to find points that unite speakers. So you both spoke of this very important shift of generation, and especially for British diplomats. What do you see as the important points regarding this change of generation? What would be, for instance, topics that British diplomats will promote from now on that will be new visions of the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the final intervention, you asked to hear.
Really, it's more of a comment. I'm a British pensioner living in Belgium, et je suis devenu un citoyen belge. Merci infiniment au pays que j'aime beaucoup. I would like to make a point about strong Britain. our pension has gone down by at least 30%. The pound is at €1.12. I would like to make a point about non-xenophobic treatment. The expats on both sides have been treated like dirt by the British government, absolute dirt. We have been received by Mr. Verhofstadt, we've been received by Mr. Barnier and listened, and our concerns have been put forward. David Davis, who's absent most of the time, never received us. No Home Secretary received us. The Home Office have tried several hundred times to deport EU people who had perfectly legitimate grounds to stay in Britain. No, thank you, Brexit. Merci beaucoup.
No question? No question? No, okay. Okay. You see that maybe Cambridge is not, but Brussels is very pluralistic, very international. Well, I propose to the two speakers to have to give some short feedback, and maybe I add one point about the future of free trade. Both of you, Britain was the champion of free trade for centuries. Until 1931 was really the pillar of the international system based on free trade and pound. The forecast is the international consequence of Brexit are very different in your case. Could you deepen this particular point? Professor Toms, will UK look for a regional trade arrangement with the European Union? In this case, will become, I don't say a satellite, but a member of a trade regional arrangement which is led by the European Union, by the famous Brussels institutions. And what about Andrew? You have concluded saying that we risk to start by global Britain and close by Britain first, with a Trumpian accent. This has a tremendous implication in terms of international trade wars, international uncertainty, and also for free trade. Even the last arrangement with NAFTA deleted the word free trade from the acronym. It's now no longer a free trade arrangement, the one with Canada and Mexico reached yesterday. So this, you have also noted that the surviving of WTO panels is at stake. So I would like to focus on this particular part of the international implications of the Brexit regarding the multilateral system, in particular the trade system. Thank you so much.
Right, well, the phrase Britain first, the only person I've ever heard use that phrase is Andrew. It's not a slogan that's used in the debate. The change of generation. Yeah, it's true that there's a clear generational difference. One could say that young people tend to be rather idealistic, or if you put it another way, rather easily manipulated. Young people in Britain have not really felt the effects of European membership except in its beneficial forms for them, like being able to have Erasmus scholarships and that sort of thing. Unlike young people in Southern Europe, they haven't felt the effects of the negative effects of EU membership, which means that in some Southern European countries, young people are more hostile to the EU than their elders. British expats, as far as I'm aware, the British government has repeatedly offered to guarantee the rights of European citizens in Britain. I don't know what it can do to influence the rights of British citizens in other EU countries. Will the UK look for a regional trade agreement? Or, what the British government of course, has always wanted and has been extremely clumsy about trying to get it, is to have free trade plus, or at least free trade that would cover services, which the present single market doesn't do. It's certainly been difficult, and we will no doubt fall back on, at least in the short term or in the medium term, on some sort of middle road such as the European Economic Area. And there was another question that you wanted me to address, and now remind me what it was.
What the future relation with between European Union and the UK in terms of trade arrangements?
Well, I think...
Is regionalism an option or just global multilateralism?
Well, what I hope will be a mutual recognition of standards, similar to that which is part of most free trade agreements, for example, the Canada deal. But what the British government would like would be greater access for services to the EU. I mean, not everybody in the city thinks this is awfully important, in the sense that there are always ways round whatever restrictions are imposed. And I think the original, rather apocalyptic predictions of disaster have been shown not only not to be true, but no longer to be believed. So I think some sort of free trade arrangement with some modifications is what one would expect to happen.
Thank you very much. Andrew Gamble.
I think the reason why so many young people in Britain are angry is because they feel their future is being stolen by a generation that, my generation, which will soon not be around. And I think that actually, amongst graduates who are now around 50% of young people, there the strength of feeling for Remain is particularly strong, and it's why so many young people have joined the People's Vote movement, calling for a second referendum on the terms of the deal. So I think that that cleavage is a really important one, which is going to reshape British politics. The Conservative Party are very concerned about their their inability to appeal any longer to young voters. So I think that is going to be one of the things which is going to be very important in shaping British politics going forward. I think the treatment of British expats is I think it is a problem. It's a wider. It's one of my fears about Brexit. It's the fact that that's already it's becoming much harder to get into Britain unless you are an EU citizen, and presumably after Brexit, EU citizens will face the same kind of restrictions which non-EU citizens currently have. I mean, it's quite common now for people, non-EU citizens, to have to wait up to 2 hours at Heathrow to clear passport control. It's this kind of closed attitudes towards of wanting to make the border policy seem much more effective. That is, I think we're likely to see more of. It's what I mean by Britain first. I mean, Britain first, yes, it's a phrase I've invented, but it's taken from Donald Trump. America first. And it just seems to me that becomes an option for a particular kind of British politics for the future. And finally, on the future of free trade and trading relationships, it seems to me that it is going to be very difficult for Britain to be an independent global trader. And and you already see this from the ferocious lobbying that's come from British business, which stands to lose the very important production chains that it has with the rest of the EU. This is the relationship with the EU is not just about trade, it's about all the production systems and the exchange of components and the exchange of labour, which have been built up over 40 years and which is a very substantial part of British prosperity. If those are to be seriously disrupted, then the British economy is going to take a very serious hit. So and that seems to me to explain what Theresa May has been trying to do and why there's such furious divisions within the Conservative Party, is because she has recognised that reality, and she and other leading members of her cabinet like Philip Hammond have been trying to get an agreement which leaves the EU but also keeps Britain as close as possible to the EU in terms of a trading relationship. Now, whether they're going to be successful, an awful lot hinges on whether they actually manage to find a way of squaring what looked like very difficult circles. The problem of persuading the European Union to relax its opposition to cherry-picking the single market, and on the other hand, the hard Brexit wing of the Conservative Party, which wants a complete clean break from the EU and no association at all with the EU post-Brexit. And it seems to me that the big issue for Britain post-Brexit, I mean, I think that pragmatism is going to win out, and that I think any future British government is going to have to try and negotiate close relationships with the European Union. And that may well mean that if that were to happen and Britain actually gets to some sort of associate membership or associate relationship with the EU, then of course Brexit won't be seen in the future as a major watershed, but really just as part of the steady evolution of Britain's rather at times fractious, at other times quite close and involved relationship with the rest of Europe.
Thank you very much, both of you. I would like to emphasize that we have had a deep discussion between the two speakers and with the public about the risk and opportunities of the international consequence and domestic consequence of the Brexit. In my opinion, the difference are also the consequence of different academic disciplinary approach. Professor Thoms is an historian and Professor Gamble is a political scientist. Historians always focus on the distinctive features of a country and of the special history of Britain, the special relation with the United States, the special history of the empire, the special economic strength and future perspective, whereas political scientists are since ever much more interested in drawing the attention on what is common for the disintegration tendencies in one country, populism in one country and in other countries. So this is the reason why probably Professor Gamble mentioned Stephen Bannon as a general ideologist of the resistance against international cooperation and the possible inward-looking effect of the Brexit. So I think this is part of the I know that the difference have also other roots. I don't want to underline ideological difference and so on. However, this is also a methodological different approach. Is absolutely natural in an academy of science where we represent so many different disciplinary approaches, and is welcome, I would say. And we thank very much both of the speakers for bringing the best out of their discipline, out their disciplinary approach to our discussion. We will continue on this issue. One of the legacy of the session of today is to address the question which has been maybe mentioned by many speakers here, the gap between we feel in Brussels, in particular, between the transnational dimension of the challenges, environment, peace, economy, and the capacity of a single sovereign state to cope with this in the 21st century. You can have an optimist or pessimist answer to this question. We will come back on this, keeping in mind the different of different countries. Of course, UK is not Hungary, is not Poland, but the question is similar under this respect. I would like to thank again and to remember everybody that on November 12 we will have a very important session with the President of the Den Haag International Court and with Professor Schreiber from Leiden about how relevant, how strong, or how declining is the weight of international courts in managing international conflicts and in general contributing to peace. So you are all invited to the November 12 session, but I would like to invite all the audience to express our thanks to the two speakers by a final applause. Thank you very much, everybody.